The whole world knows about the righteous Charlotte Uprising against police killings and racism. On September 20th, Charlotte cops murdered Keith Lamont Scott when the unarmed black man was reading a book. Scott, a loving father of 7 children, was waiting for one of his children to come home from school. Behind Keith Scott's killers is a wealthy power structure. Charlotte is Wall Street of the South. Bank of America's headquarters are there. The octopus has over $2 trillion in assets. This vast wealth, all of which is unpaid human labor, is sucked from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the multinational working class in the United States. Charlotte police are just the hired guns, mercenaries, gangsters for this super bank that's has foreclosed on hundreds of thousands of houses from coast to coast. Detroit comrades have fought to save people's houses from these vultures. Bank of America is a newcomer to the Carolinas. For a century, it was based in San Francisco. It was the biggest U.S. bank in terms of assets in the 1960s, and it was the only big bank to support Barry Goldwater, who said he wanted to lob an H-bomb into the Kremlin when he ran for president in 1964. Much of the bank's wealth was tied up with mortgages on ranches and big farms throughout California. Behind the abject poverty of the Golden State's 700,000 farm workers and their families was Bank of America. It was Governor Reagan and Bank of America and Wells Fargo that declared war on the United Farm Workers Union and tried to break the Great Boycott. Just as important in Charlotte today is the Duke family, whose fortune was based on the American Tobacco Trust, whose cancer sticks have killed millions. Before sugar and cotton, tobacco was the biggest crop grown by slaves. Today, the Duke fortune is tied up with utilities. Duke Energy is one of the capitalist outfits that's cooking the earth. North Carolina was a slave state. Reconstruction, that brief period of democracy in the South, was overthrown in North Carolina in 1870. That's earlier than any other southern state. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in Black Reconstruction about how 40,000 Klan terrorists infested the Tar Heel state. Reconstruction Governor Holden was impeached by racists for fighting the Klan. Textiles became the biggest industry in the Carolinas and the key to its politics. For 30 years, the Duke family and the textile bosses put Ku Klux Klan Senator Jesse Helms in the U.S. Senate. Helms was the son of a brutal sheriff in Monroe, North Carolina, just 35 miles southeast from Charlotte. Mabel and Robert Williams organized armed self-defense against the Klan there. Comrade Deirdre Griswold, editor of Workers' World newspaper, went to Monroe to support the freedom fighters. Richard Nixon's racist Southern strategy in 1968 was also a textile strategy. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond's machine threw its support to Nixon to keep African Americans and unions out of the mills. Big textile capitalist boss Union buster Roger Milliken became Nixon's finance chairman. In 1996, Milliken was the financial angel of Pat Buchanan's fascist drive to become president. When Ethel Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond began their sit-in a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960, just 1 out of 30 textile workers were black. 18 years later, in 1978, African Americans held a quarter of the jobs in Southern textile mills. Hiring black workers in Southern textile mills is one of the greatest triumphs of the civil rights movement. Excluding African Americans from these factories became as necessary as lynching to the white supremacist terrorist regimes that followed Reconstruction's bloody overthrow. It was key to manipulating and brainwashing white workers who were so desperately poor themselves. Rebel yells and cross burnings weren't enough to do this. White sharecroppers and small farmers living in poverty could unite with African Americans in similar conditions. They actually did so during the populist movement that shook the South in the 1880s and 1890s, and this, as described in Comrade Vince Copeland's classic pamphlet, Southern Populism and Black Labor. In 1895, North Carolina's state legislature adjourned for a day upon hearing Frederick Douglass died. White and black fusionists kept re-electing George H. White, the last African American in Congress. But in 1898, black people were driven out of Wilmington, North Carolina in a bloody massacre. In 1901, George H. White gave his farewell speech in the House of Representatives, declaring that African Americans would rise up someday like a phoenix. Speeches of Thanksgiving or even the Wilmington Massacre weren't enough to establish white supremacy. A place had to be found for the white masses. That place was the textile mill. Between 1880 and 1900, the number of textile workers in the South increased 6 times, from 16,000 to 97,000. An even greater expansion of Southern textile mills started in the 1920s. That's when Yankee corporations like J.P. Stevens abandoned their union-vulnerable plants in New England and moved there. These outfits remembered the revolt of textile employees in Lawrence, Massachusetts, led by the industrial workers of the world in 1912. The South was their salvation. Wages in Southern mills were up to 40% below the Northern average. By 1961, the region accounted for 89% of textile production in the United States. Keeping African Americans out of textile factories was a new departure for the South. North Carolina's tobacco plants were segregated, but half the workers are African American. Throughout the region, sawmills employed black and white workers. The racial division of labor in the textiles was essential to the Jim Crow system. By 1973, nearly 700,000 textile workers were employed in 8 southern states. The virtual prohibition of African Americans until the late 1960s and what was the South's largest industry was a tremendous psychological factor in maintaining racism's stranglehold on generations of white workers. No other manufacturing industry in the United States was segregated for so long. In the southeastern textile belt, millions of black workers lived near mills where they couldn't get a job. Living in company towns and forced to buy from company stores, poor whites often had their brains owned by the company as well. Yet some whites did break with Jim Crow. The most notable example was the Gastonia, North Carolina strike, led by the Communist Party in 1929. Despite a fanatically intense campaign of race baiting, hundreds of white workers remained loyal to the National Textile Workers Union, which called for equality between black and white workers. The strike was drowned in blood. Among its martyrs was 29-year-old Ella Mae Wiggins, a white strike leader. She was shot to death in broad daylight on September 14, 1929. Typical of the poverty suffered by these white textile workers was that 4 of her children died of whooping cough. Textile workers were seething. They exploded in 1934. 170,000 workers went on strike in the South. The response of the bosses and their state governments was to mobilize 23,000 sheriff deputies, National Guard soldiers, private gunmen. After receiving $20,000 from mill owners, Georgia Governor Eugene Talmadge declared martial law. A concentration camp for strikers was set up at Fort McPherson near Atlanta. 13 strikers were killed in the South. 7 workers were murdered alone at a mill in Honia Pass, South Carolina. Like the failure of the populist movement 40 years before, the despair produced by this broken strike became the basis of even a more virulent racism. North Carolina in 1965 had a bigger Klan membership than any other state. None of this could stop the irresistible drive for black freedom. The Carolinas and the entire textile belt became a crucible of the civil rights movement. Textile barons didn't rush to comply with civil rights laws. Jim Crow toilets were the norm in the Greensboro plants of cone mills until 1973. White companies were hiring black men for the worst jobs. It was difficult for African American women to get any jobs at all. Kept out of office positions, black women often were hired for the heavy jobs reserved for black men. Like our late comrade Sue Steinman, who organized telephone operators to speak out against AT&T at the EEOC hearings in 1972, activists used legal actions to mobilize poor people. With struggle, there was progress. In 1964, less than 5% of textile workers in South Carolina were African American. By 1976, nearly 1 in 3 were. The changing composition led to a limited but real change of consciousness among white workers. Racism didn't disappear. African Americans had to struggle against vicious supervisors and bigoted workers just to stay in the job. But black and white workers were being brought together in the mills. The physical barriers between them were torn down as separate entrances, time clocks, and bathrooms were abolished. Just the fact they could eat together was important. The normal human desire to communicate with other people were freed from segregation's straitjacket. Women took the lead in forming friendships. The door was open to organize the South. North Carolina was a beehive of activity throughout the 1970s. The largest organizing drive of the decade against J.P. Stevens was fought there. The company's workforce was 23% black by 1974. Foreman told white workers the union was black-dominated. Many white Many whites refused to swallow this sewage. I really admire the black vote, said Donald Tifton, a white Stevens worker. They stand up for their rights. I think the whites have a lot to learn about that. With a boycott wearing it down, J.P. Stevens was forced to sign a contract. Despite these battles, a massive upsurge of textile workers, akin to the 1934 uprising or the CIO organizing drives later in the decade, never happened. Racism became the biggest obstacle. The crude race-baiting tactics were used in dozens of other campaigns. It was a hopeful minority of white workers who were waking up like Donald Tifton. The burden of the fighting was carried by African Americans. In almost every successful organizing effort, the workforce were a majority or near majority black. These struggles were breaking out at the same time the bourgeoisie was intensifying its war against black America. A new deluge of racism came gushing down from the top of capitalist society. These forces framed up Reverend Ben Chavis and the rest of the Wilmington 10. 19 years after the first sit-in in Greensboro, the capitalists allowed Klan members and Nazis to slaughter 5 Communist Workers' Party militants in the same city on November 3rd, 1979. Caesar Cosse, Mike Nathan, Bill Sampson, Sandy Smith, and Jim Waller were murdered in front of TV cameras. None of the assassins spent a day in jail. Like the Honia Path atrocity in 1934, the Greensboro Massacre was approved by the capitalist class. Political frame-ups of murders couldn't prevent workers from wanting unions. Closing factories was more effective. Kannapolis, North Carolina was devastated as the cannon mills were shut down. LMA Wiggins didn't die in vain, neither did the martyrs at Honia Path or Greensboro. They are in the hotels and offices. The fighters in Charlotte streets are their daughters and sons. Long live the Charlotte Uprising.